Hello again, Colin here. This video is part 3 in the Domino static site generation series, and I thought it was suitable to do a sidebar on rendering because in talking to a whole bunch of developers who started to get familiar with React, there's a lot of confusion on client-side rendering, server-side rendering, and different variants thereof. So we'll start covering some real basics. Want to be respectful of your time, so I'll try to be quick with it. Okay, here we go. First, what's motivating the requirements for these things? We like file-based routing. File-based routing is very convenient. And by that, if you're not a long-time React developer, this might sound weird because it's the way the web originally worked. But when you have folder hierarchies, if you put a page component in those folder hierarchies, it automatically becomes a route or a URL that's reachable. In React, the modern frameworks allow this, and they allow it to happen with client-side routing. Client-side routing maintains state on page transitions as well. So that's pretty important. It doesn't force a full page load when it rewrites the DOM. From page to page, you maintain state on the client. Static site generation is a really nice thing, and that's the whole premise to this series. It's not suitable for every app or site, but we'll talk about where it is. We want to be able to keep a separate backend. We don't need an all-in-one front-end / backend app like some frameworks want you to do nowadays. And a lot of React developers may not even want any node interpreter at all at runtime on the server. And so if you've got a backend in any language, could be Domino, could be a standalone Java app, .NET, you name it, anything, you may be quite happy with your API layer, and you may not want to be forced to do this all in one thing that does data access and front-end UX all in one application. In the case of the Domino REST APIs, we could have a backend for front-end pattern where there's a backend app that we call to from the front end, and then it calls the Domino REST APIs. But for static site generation, that's not even required. And let me show you how. The next thing to talk about is when you hear about server-side rendering and how it's just an absolute necessity, I'd say think first about whether this is a website requiring SEO. Websites requiring SEO, in our opinion, have a special class of requirements that don't apply to many, I won't necessarily say most, but a great many other apps. So if you're creating a website that requires SEO, you're going to want to follow Google's published core web vitals. And that's how it's what impacts your rank when they crawl your site and index it. So these are LCP, the largest contentful paint, which is how long does it take to load and paint the largest element on the home page. First input delay, how long until the site or app is responsive to the first user input. Cumulative layout shift, CLS. So that is, as the page loads, do things change proportions and positions? Do they move around? And this can be because you've got unsized images and things like that. So you've probably seen when pages load, and then as the browser fills in the images after they're loaded, things jump around and resize, and it goes kind of bananas on you. So that's to be avoided if we care about core web vitals. And some are pushing that server-side rendering or server-side rendering plus static site generation is needed for things other than websites requiring SEO. In our opinion, it's not. But if it's a public website that SEO matters, then it does matter a bit more. We'll elaborate on that. However, a lot of other apps, slightly longer load times are okay. Why? Repeat users means that files are often cached. Long session times could be really long. People might use an app all day long. So you don't need to do this in all cases, but for certain cases, it's really useful. So let's talk about rendering variants. Starting with static HTML files. If we took, nobody hard codes static HTML much anymore, but if you did, and you threw them on a web server, the way most web servers work is there's a configured welcome page and a welcome file path or expression. And by default, if you have a document root, which is where the website files are posted on the web server, when an HTTP request comes in for /, it'll look at the root of document root and serve the welcome file, such as index.html. In other apps like Java apps, you might have index.jsp if it's a Java server pages app or any other number of things, but that's how it works. Now, if you do a request to /subfolder1, it's going to look in there and see is there a welcome file in that path. So this is kind of important in how SSG works. In this example on the bottom right, you see a simple index HTML, and on the bottom left, what that looks like. What's important is the content type that's served from the web server to the browser is just HTML. because it's literally sending the bytes of that index.html file to the browser. There's nothing that has to execute on the server. There's no server-side process to do rendering. It just takes the contents of that file and serves it. This is different than old school server-side apps with no client-side rendering. So in this case, maybe you've got a database and an app server process that reads it, but the way it's going to work is a request comes in from the browser. If your web server is set up as a reverse proxy, it proxies that to the app server. The app server then fields that request. Some dynamic code in your app server will then execute. It's going to return markup, so it's going to return HTML. The app server returns HTML to the web server. The web server, once again, returns HTML to the browser. In both these cases, what the browser got back was HTML. Also noteworthy that you're typically going to do full page requests and full page reloads in response to user interaction. So really old apps, that's the way they worked. Bottom right, you can see examples like maybe I've got an app context in a Java app and I've got an index.jsp, or a classic ASP example, if you remember them, later ASPX for .NET. That's going to differ from client-side apps in React, which will be the next part.